Hello, the internet, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends, and happy Thanksgiving if you're listening from the United States. I have returned to the translation of Grigoras, the 14th century historian, who wrote what is the longest surviving historical Greek text. So I'm trying to do a volume a year or something like that. Now, when he uses certain terms that we traditionally translate as empire or emperor, I am honestly reluctant to use those in my translation, since we're talking about a Roman state that is limited to Constantinople and some small parts of Thrace. Not sure exactly in what sense that qualifies as an empire, which brings us to the topic of today's discussion. Now, some of you may know, pre-modern historical scholarship has entered for some time now into what is sometimes referred to as a imperial turn. That is, suddenly empires are an attractive topic of research. And there's considerable attention now paid to pre-modern imperial regimes, with a kind of seriousness that never really marked 20th century scholarship. Empires were regarded as, in a certain sense, obsolete, sort of replaced by nation states. There's a kind of arc to modern history which leads to the replacement of empires by nation states. They were also regarded as generally oppressive, born out of conquest, such that many modern nations trace their founding moments to liberation from an empire. There's hardly any political theory or serious ideology that would justify an empire in the modern world, and so they're seen as a kind of sort of quaint antiquarian topic of research, or it was. I actually distinctly remember the moment when I realized that might be changing. I was driving to work one day and morning, and it was late 2002, and it was the first time that I heard plans that the U.S. was thinking of invading and conquering the country of Iraq. And I was floored. I honestly couldn't exactly picture in my mind what that would look like. It's one thing to organize coups and overthrow the leadership of another country, or to bully their economies, or to have massive military bases on their territory, or to twist their arms into buying your weapons whether they need them or not, and so on. But it struck me as very sort of classical to just go in with an army and conquer their territory, and then, install proconsuls? Exactly what are you going to do then? In retrospect, this moment when the United States made a play for empire in a kind of almost classical way was a turning point in the scholarly literature, even on pre-modern empires. There was a whole raft of books that came out on whether America was or was not an empire in the wake of this decision. It turned out the planners of it also did not know exactly what they were going to do. And there were also discussions about, well, yes, okay, America is now more of an empire, or we can admit that it is. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So I remember books taking opposite sides on that question. But there were other reasons, too, that were contributing to this kind of renaissance in empire studies. One of them, for example, was the realization that empires and nation-states are not sort of historically antithetical concepts or entities. Very often, modern nation-states were created out of medieval or early modern processes of imperialism. And conversely, nation-states can create empires of their own, and as we were witnessing. Moreover, the idea that nation-states are ideally constituted to, let's say, protect the rights of all of their citizens, or at least that they were better at doing this than certain empires, has also come into question, at least if you look at some empires on a case-by-case basis. And then there are questions about whether certain historical societies that we call empires conventionally really were that. Do they really fit a sociological definition? Or are we calling them that out of a kind of inertia derived from the philology of titles, which I think is what's happening in the case of the entity known as Byzantium, which I've argued in some phases of its history is not really an imperial regime at all. All of which is to say that empire studies are now very interesting, diverse, sophisticated, and are often asking questions that we weren't asking in the 20th century, or at least not with the kind of seriousness that they are now. My guest today is Thomas Barfield, who is a professor of anthropology at Boston University. Most of his primary research focuses on Afghanistan, as he will mention in the discussion. But there's an idea that he threw out there a long time ago, maybe a generation ago, about a particular type of empire that, in the formulation of his most recent book, which we will be discussing, was a sort of shadow empire. So it's an empire that preyed on other empires. And this is the topic of the book that we will be talking about, which is called Shadow Empires: An Alternative Imperial History. And it proposes an interesting classification, so very broadly speaking, of empires into two types: those that generate most of their resources from their own territory that they control and govern, and those that generate a considerable part of their resources from elsewhere, from either from other empires, from extracting or extorting tribute payments and so on, or via transit nodes of trade along the coasts, but without controlling much territory, or swooping into the territories of a dying empire and sort of picking through the pieces or trying to reconstruct parts of the mechanism that made it work earlier. The book, I should add, for all of you out there, is very well written and accessible, and it ranges very widely through time and space, with an emphasis on Asia for the most part, but otherwise reaching from antiquity to the present, and at the very end talking about why empires have gone extinct, empires of both kinds, because there are different dynamics that apply to each category. But just to give you a sense of the categories that he presents and sort of provides an analytical model for, by telling their stories often. There's a lot of narrative in here, and it's very useful for understanding the underlying dynamics. There are shadows, that is shadow empires, shadows on the sea, shadows on the steppe, shadows on the horizon, shadows of the past. These are empires of nostalgia, which is a great concept. I love that. Shadows in the forest, and in one place there's also a category of the jellyfish empire, which is wonderful. You really should read this book if you're interested in just the historical experience of empires. And Tom, as you will see, is wonderful at presenting the stories of these empires and at finding these kinds of labels, these very memorable concepts and terms for the various categories that he discusses. This was a very fun discussion, and we could have gone on much, much longer. I've actually had to cut some of it out in order to fit it into the rough time frame of the podcast. But just so that you know, we touch on only a few of the ideas and stories that are in the book. So if you want the full picture, definitely go read it. Tom is a great storyteller and analyst. So thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Let's get straight to my conversation with Thomas Barfield. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I was very glad to see your book because about 24 years ago now, I had read an article that you had written and published in a volume that I had read. It's a volume on empires. And this was an article that you'd written on shadow empires. And it actually cleared up a lot in my mind. Now you're mostly focused on Central Asia, and in your book, there's an emphasis on China and the other empires it had contact with. But it actually helped me a lot in thinking about the Eastern Roman Empire and some of its interactions with other empires. And then I couldn't find more from you on this. So apparently you went on a 20-year, well, not detour, but you were doing other things. Can you tell us what you were doing in the meantime?
Sure. I began my work as an anthropologist in Afghanistan in the mid-1970s. I did my dissertation on a group of nomads in northern Afghanistan, actually on the banks of the Oxus River. nice classical air to it.
Yeah.
And spent around 18 months, 2 years working with them in the mid 70s before all these wars began. And I published an ethnography on them, the Central Asian Arabs of Afghanistan. Although they're Persian speakers, they claim descent from the Arab armies that conquered Central Asia. Um, and then the Soviet Union invaded. I couldn't go back. So I thought, well, let's do a little bit of history. And that's when I switched to working on nomad China relationships, sort of Great Wall politics. And that resulted in the perilous frontier nomadic empires in China, sort of 300 BC to 1757, sort of like. And so I was invited because of that work to present the case of the Xiongnu and the Han Dynasty at a Winter Gren conference. And the article, the book chapter that came out of that conference was essentially the models of empire, because there must have been 24 people with different empires. And of course, there were huge arguments about who's an empire, who isn't. And my nomad empires were definitely on the, what are these guys doing here? So it's one of these Winter Gren conferences that runs like 5 days. So halfway through, people asked to present their thoughts. And that's when I came up with this model. And it was only half a chapter because the first presented the case of the Xiongnu. And I thought, well, it's an interesting model. I should really get back to it. But the book came out in 2001. And of course, 9/11 happened in 2001. And so the lack of interest in Afghanistan, I don't think my university even knew that I had worked in Afghanistan. Didn't care, never offered any courses on it. Who wanted to take them? Suddenly it was greatly in demand. And so I switched my focus back to Afghanistan, which is actually where I had the strongest research skills. I went back, and sort of for the next 20 years, every year as I was going back to Afghanistan, I became president of the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies. 5 of my PhD students in anthropology did new research on Afghanistan. So I was focused on Afghanistan, wrote a book on Afghanistan, a cultural and political history, which is sort of one of the, it was a huge amount of interest. Everybody going to an embassy or a military official, they all read the book, which surprised me. It's an academic. Wow. And so went back and forth. Around 2017, things were stalemated in Afghanistan. I didn't think I had anything much new to say about it. I decided I needed to do something different. And that's when I thought, I had always thought it's a really interesting model that I had presented on empires. In some ways, I was surprised some historian, more competent one, had not stolen it and said, great ideas here, let me show you how to do this. But nobody ever did. It was really widely cited, and people would use aspects of their models that I had. But anthropologists have nothing to lose. So if we're incredibly comparative like that, it's like, wow, you have no reputation to lose, so why not do it? And so I came back and thought, the East Asian ones, the China, I had already sort of presented, but not in this format, and decided I needed to look at other Eurasian, North African empires, just to bring the whole thing together as examples of this rather brief model that I had put together. So I had a sabbatical, I began doing that. Then COVID hit, so I had plenty of time on my hands to look at these cases. And a lot of the material was empires that I knew vaguely, but I had to immerse myself into them to see, well, how do my models work? Do I need to revise the models? Test them out against the historical material. And so that became a book length monograph. But yeah, like the 20 years I was involved pretty much in Afghan affairs, not just anthropological ones, but there was international agencies, governments were all asking for what's going on in Afghanistan. How do you explain what's going on?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but I doubt that sort of policy people are going to read this book necessarily, but I'm glad that you wrote it because it really helps us on the historical side. By the way, this sometimes happens to people who work on specific areas. I saw it vicariously through one of my professors at Michigan in the 90s, who was mostly a medieval Balkan historian. This is John Fine, but in the 90s with the war in Yugoslavia, he got pulled into that, being one of the very few academic experts on that region and its history. at the time of all of the wars in Yugoslavia, and he ended up writing books about that and writing memos for policies and so forth. But what he really wanted to do in the background was write something on church history, I think, from late antiquity. Anyway, all right, so let's dive into it. What are shadow empires, or differently, what is the difference between what you call endogenous and exogenous empires?
Yeah, when we're debating empires, there are a lot of things that are called empires. And one of the problems about not having sort of models is they don't seem to fit, or what goes in, what goes out. And so when I looked at it, I had first come up with the idea of primary empires that are sui generis. They come out of an area, they expand outward from a center, they have their own resources. But a lot of empires, when actually come into existence, is a secondary phenomenon. That is, if you're not going to be eaten by an empire, then in some senses you mimic that empire on a different basis. And of course, this came out of the research that I had done on China and the nomads, the Xiongnu and Han, is when China unifies, suddenly the nomads are unifying. Well, the Chinese are building the Great Wall. They have a huge army. They don't like nomads. They want them to keep out. In order to protect themselves, the nomads unify. But their ability to stay unified depends upon extorting the resources of China. So there's an interaction, a phenomenon. But nobody likes to be called secondary, right? I mean,
or parasitical.
Or parasitic. There's a number of things. If it's your empire,
yes.
No, we did it ourselves. Okay,
Yeah.
where did the fact that that one could say the Industrial Revolution in Japan is secondary, it is not a knock.
Right.
It's in Europe, but they create, but somehow but when I began thinking about it, the primary secondary was not really the issue. That's because something comes into existence in response to something else is not the major issue. So the endogenous empires essentially were self-sustaining. They started a center, they moved out, they lived, they ate what they caught. And the bigger they grew, the resources went to the center. These other empires, however, the ones I call exogenous, the thing they all had in common, although they're quite different, is they rely on outside resources in some way. And the resources can be really different. The Xiongnu, the nomads in Mongolia, they extort China. They cut trade deals. But if one turns to the Athenians, they're quite different. They come into response to Persian expansion, but their empire is not based on conquest. It's based on controlling economics. But again, that's an exogenous source. I have other empires, that move into the remains of a collapsed empire. That's also exogenous. So in the end, if you looked, all the exogenous empires, the key thing about them was they got the things that held them together, not necessarily how they formed, but the things that held them together were largely resources coming from the outside. So their political and military strategies were based on getting those exogenous resources sustainable.
Right.
But how they did that was really quite different. The structures they did. So, as I said, as Tolstoy said about unhappy families, all endogenous empires are kind of alike. All exogenous empires are exogenous in their own way.
Yeah.
So, but putting them together as a category and then breaking them up, I can say, okay, what elements of an endogenous empire do they have? What do they lack? But they're still peer polities. They're recognized as empires by other polities. So it came out to, okay, there's different varieties. If you can understand their dynamics and particularly understand their interactions, you get a better hold on what makes an empire, how it changes, and in particular, with almost all of my examples of the exogenous empires, if you are too successful, if a shadow empire is too successful, comes out of the shadows and actually takes over, like the nomads conquering China, or the British expanding through India, or the Mongols conquering most of Eurasia. Even though you start out as a shadow empire, you find yourself becoming an exogenous one because now you are in charge of administering, taxing, controlling the lands. You're not,
Right.
cashing a check from somebody else. And when you do that, however, you bring your own cultural baggage with you. So the Mongol Empire in China, the Yuan dynasty, looks nothing in many. It's an anomaly in terms of the way they organize China compared to others. So when we look at something like this, we can see people bring, if you will, their shadow heritage that the British love working indirectly in India while they're conquering all of South. Why are they signing so many treaties with princes? Why are they doing that?
Right.
Because they come out of a tradition of a maritime empire where you're interested in economics and you focus on outsourcing the politics if you can. Once you get too big, hey, you run the whole thing. You've got to do it. You've got to control it. But the dynamic, the look of that empire is a bit different. So that if one looks at the Manchus in China, it controls all of China, but it's twice, maybe three times as big as any Chinese empire. How is it that the Chinese cannot incorporate Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and the Manchus do it rather easily? Different mentality. The Chinese see the people to the north of them as uncivilizable. We don't want these people.
Right.
We'll build a wall. The Manchus, we are those people. So
Right.
we conquer China, but we're Manchu. We can add Mongols who are practically our cousins. If we have to go with Tibetans, we adopt their Buddhism, and they have no trouble with this, whereas the Chinese do. So the question is, when we look at particularly supersized empires, which is really interesting in the 18th century, whether it's the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the British Empire, the interesting thing is they all have shadow origins. Why were the largest empires in the world? Why did they begin as shadows? And in some ways, it's because their definition of what was a core and what was a periphery were different. And
Okay.
they had no compulsion about thinking extremely broadly and having the tools to, we can bring these people in because we're not going to necessarily make them alike. We'll deal with
Yeah.
what we got.
Okay, so we'll talk about some of these categories later on because you offer an interesting typology of different kinds of shadow empires. And this is part of what drew me into the book because in all of this kind of imperial turn, right, that historical studies are going through now, we haven't seemed to have generated very many of these kinds of typologies just for sorting empires into different categories. And this is one way of doing it. And it seems to me it'll have some staying power. I can imagine other ways of sorting them. But what were the original problems that prompted you to start formulating it? What were you trying to solve, or what had you observed that was insufficiently theorized? Was it this particular relationship between the Xiangju and China, or was it a broader pattern that you had seen?
It first started out with this relationship between China and the nomads in Mongolia. And a lot of that came out of the Chinese records. The Han Dynasty, in its early phase, signs a treaty with the Xiongnu that recognizes them as co-equal states. Also agrees to send to Chinese princes, send food, send alcohol. And this is debated in court for the next 50 years because it violates a Sinocentric Confucian world order. And they say, how can these people who are totally uncultured and number less than a Chinese province? We are 50 million people and they are less than 1 million. Like, how is this equal? They have a huge territory, but there's no agriculture in it. How do we, all these things were exaggerations, but the Chinese are saying, it's not an empire like ours. Yeah, but we're signing treaties with them. I mean, we're admitting they're co-equal, and it takes 70, 80 years. They go to war to change that, to create the tributary system. We will have no equals. But when I looked at that, I said, well, how is it that 1 million nomads are managing to be pure polities to China? And that's when I came up. They have various strategies. They use their horse cavalry. They use their military. They burn down chunks of North China. But the interesting thing is they never try to conquer them. Why? They don't know how to rule China, nor do they have the people to do it. And if those big armies showed up, they would be toast. And so they do like other nomad armies. When you see somebody coming, you run away. Herodotus talks about this with the Scythians.
Right.
The Achaemenid Shah says, "Why don't you guys stand still and fight?" And it's like, "Hey, why? Because we could be beat."
Right.
And it says, "Catch us if you can." And then when they go home, they shoot arrows all the way back. And there's a famous Parthian shot where, good, your enemy is retreating, and you're losing your army as they're retreating because they can fight from the rear. It's a particular cavalry style of fighting, and the Xiongnu got it, but it turns out that raiding is not cost effective. So what you do is send an envoy to the Chinese court and say, "How about we have a peace treaty and you send us all the stuff that we're stealing? And that way we won't attack you. It's cheaper. You won't have an army."
Right.
And so they do. And then they come back, they start raiding again. They says, that's not only do we want more stuff, our ordinary people want trade rights because you closed off the border. So they fight wars to get trade rights. The interesting thing is it moves from predatory to a bit parasitic, but then it becomes symbiotic because as all these Chinese empires, famous ones like the Han Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, as they weaken, the nomads are being paid off. They don't want to see that dynasty fall. So when great rebellions happen in China, the nomads, particularly in the Tang Dynasty, they come in and put it down.
Right.
Because they're being paid 100,000 bolts of silk.
Right. All of the phenomena that you describe resonate with me as a historian of East Rome. They all happened at one time or another. And one of the reasons I asked you that question was, so you answered in a very interesting way. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance in the Chinese court about what it is that they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And they're having to invent what in a Roman context we would call legal fictions. That is when you recognize that something isn't something, but you're going to treat it as if it is. And that creates all these interesting historical phenomena. Okay, so we're going to get into some of these issues in specific cases later on. But first, I wanted to ask you what generally you think an empire is. An empire is one of those things where we kind of know it when we see it in part. And I recognize the states that you discuss in here as empires, even though some are democracies, some are republics, some are monarchies, and so forth. But I ask the question because it's a particularly problematic one in my field, because we call, sort of, quote, Byzantium an empire, not necessarily because of its sociology or history, but the philology of titles, which is a whole other way of identifying them. But since you don't seem to go by monarchs and rulers and titles, what is your understanding of an empire broadly?
Well, my basic thing is that it starts out, it's a state that expands by conquest. And I kind of say on a subcontinental scale that incorporates a million, and often tens of millions of people. I mean, Rome, Persia, China, they're all both running 40, 50 million people at their height, which is like a good, maybe half of the world population, at some point. But that's how they get started. All right. In the book, I say that's a minimal definition of looking, because like many of my exogenous empires do not meet that standard. That's the whole reason. They look like empires, but they're missing something. So let's just start with the endogenous ones, like Persia, like China, like Rome. The things that they all have in common are centralized institutions of governance that were separate and distinct from their rulers. And that makes them different from kingdoms. If we look at the Carolingians or the others, one of the problems they have about even having an empire is they constantly think, or the Merovingians before them, when the king dies, the first thing is to divide the kingdom up among his heirs. An empire is not divisible. It's an institution that the emperor, the ruler, rules an institution, but it's not his personal property. And it always has a singular ruler. Now, when Rome splits up, you have Caesars and Augustus, but nevertheless, there's an idea that it's a single thing. And it's very much, if you will, almost like a modern corporation. It exists outside of its leadership. I said that, Louis XIV repeatedly, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. that may be apocryphal, but when he died, because there were people around, he said, I am going, but the state remains. And that's the essence of these empires, is in terms of their leadership. Central, and it's highly centralized. It's distinct from the people that run it, and they all have bureaucracies. One of the reasons they can be distinct from the rulers is they have very well developed bureaucracies that run the state, all right, and move from ruler to ruler. The other thing is that they think broadly. They have systems of communication. If we look in terms of how you get imperial languages, or, something that you can run the empire in. It's not always one language. And in China, it's the written language, even though people can't. It's ideographics. People don't necessarily speak it. But they have systems of communication that allows all subject areas to be ruled from the center directly. Right? That's an important thing, too. Exactly how much control the center has, that varies, but there's a center, there's an apex, if you will. Exogenous empires also demand, they say, have a singular right to rule over the territory they are, and they expand outwards. There's an inside and outside. That's, there's a frontier and a center. We get to some exogenous empires, that's sometimes not really there. And one of the most interesting things I think they have is they have some kind of imperial project to bring order to their empire, to make people think. I was reading your own work on, how can, you've got Romanía, you've got Romans, but they're speaking Greek. How could they do that? It doesn't matter what that order is, but the empire can do it. In China, it's kind of a Confucian worldview, Confucian order. In other cases, it's a mix of things. In later, I'd say, post-antiquity empires, it's like monotheistic religions. Particularly if you look at the Rus and then later Muscovy in Russia, what you see is the state uses Eastern Orthodox Christianity as a way to bring unity over an incredibly diverse people that they didn't have. But it's an imperial project, such that the use of calendars, when's our beginning date? What do we create? And in your own work, what surprised me, mostly because I didn't know anything about it, was how could it be that Egyptians and Syrians would see themselves as Romans, not because of Greek speaking, but because in the past, Egypt, Syria was so culturally different. And whatever the Romans were doing in the East, it was remarkably successful as an imperial project for making people to think this is us. Of course, they did it in the West with Gaul. It's what Caesar conquers, and 2 centuries later is entirely different. And we see that in modern European countries, like, say, in France. Asterix the Gaul is one of the best-selling books. The French ranked top 100 in the 20th century. And at the same time, they are proud descendants of the Roman Empire. Well, there's a little discontinuity here.
Yes.
Semele Londonia. Yeah, this is really great. But you go down and, there's Boudica, great opponent of the Roman Empire that's defeated. And as I say, they put that statute up when they are putting down rebellions in India and South Africa, and can praise an anti-imperialist of their own. There's an interest but it's an imperial project. And the thing that I found most interesting about this, and I put it in the book, that imperial projects are implemented in a series of stages that move from coercion. We own you guys. This is the way we're going to do things. To co-optation. Who wants to hold a high rank by becoming a citizen or adopting our language? To cooperation, the whole society begins to think, what other models? Let's do it. And the final stage is identification. That people who had to be destroyed, coerced 3-4 generations before, now proudly declare themselves to be members and identify with the empire that destroyed their ancestors. But it's a cognitive change in which the other becomes us. And empires are really excellent at doing that. Kingdoms and others, not so much,
Right.
So the case that you have in Rome and in China of making people alike is one way of dealing with that. the Ottomans or the Persians or the others. We will let people keep their own identity as long as they adopt a common respect for our political culture. When I say that empires specialize in diversity, it's because they don't stop just because people are different than them, but they have two ways to go with diversity. One is, can we incorporate these people into a single model so they and us become the same? Or do we manipulate, as the Ottomans did, all the different groups, and we satisfy each group such that, problem for neo-Ottomans today in Turkey is the Ottoman Empire doesn't see itself as Turkish.
Right.
It's Ottoman, okay? And
It's a
there
dynastic
were plenty
project.
of Arabs and Syrians and Egyptians. Their officials were Ottoman. Or the number of Albanians, when you begin to search, like, we don't call them Albanians because they were Ottoman officials. They may rule Egypt, but we think, oh yeah, they're Ottoman official, and then we immediately think Turk, which is not necessarily correct, because that's not, you could enter the Ottoman elite and the ethnicity didn't matter.
Right.
You were using the Osmanli Turkish, and the Ottomans themselves, precisely because they make sure their sultans marry slaves, they don't even have any relatives. Okay, they don't have any of these kinds of alliances. How much Ottoman is left after 500 years of intermarrying women from all over North Africa or
Or
Asia?
put differently, I mean, there's a large population that is descended from the Ottoman dynasty,
Yes,
conversely, by the same logic.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the Ottomans do not. They, I call them equal opportunity oppressors. If a Hobbesian bargain, we will not allow your neighbors to kill you. Nobody kills anyway. We're the only killers here, right? Like, nobody's allowed to kill each other. And Thomas Hobbes said, well, that's a pretty good bargain. If only the ruler can kill people. And he's supposed to protect your life, in a bad world, that's keeps life better than it could be in a state of nature.
Yeah, that's why I was so interested in your discussion of this policy toward diversity or diversity management, because as you mentioned, some empires go in one direction that is toward increasing uniformity, whether by policy or that's just how it happens. And others were more invested in sort of maintaining difference or keeping groups kind of
Right.
separate. You have your own gods or
Yeah.
your own religion. And so like the Persian and Ottoman are on one side of that divide, and the Roman and the Chinese are on the other. And in the Roman case, especially the late Roman case, once you have a universal citizenship and the high officials are from all the provinces, and you know there's a lot more uniformity that happens. Um, it's much less, I mean, an empire defined by diversity. And in fact, the late Roman Empire becomes somewhat hostile to diversity in religion. So they start to impose, single, orthodoxy, and groups that dissent from that are penalized in the law. And at that point, I think we've moved outside of the kind of territory of those empires as you define them. But anyway, so let's go back to the ones that you do talk about in more detail in your book. And so what I thought we would do is I will mention one of the categories and you tell us what it is. Maybe give us an example, the archetype that you were thinking of maybe when you devised the category. And then I will tell you one from the history of the East Roman state, whether a phase of it or some other state that it interacted with. And I think that will give us a nice little counterpoint. So I'll start with the shadow empires of the sea.
Yeah, these are maritime empires, and actually, surprisingly, they're the earliest ones because we see Persia expanding. I mean, it's 5 million square kilometers. It runs from Libya to the Indus. It is enormous, and um, it also controls a lot of Greek city-states. You know, off the Anatolian coast. It's taken over the Phoenician states, so it controls a lot of people with a maritime tradition. And then partially because the Athenians sort of helped some rebels against the Achaemenids. The Eye of Mordor turns on them. And we get a Darius the Great who has rounded out. I mean, he has campaigned in Central Asia, in the Indus, all over. He goes against the Scythians, in Ukraine, and doesn't work. But he's rounding out the empire, sort of hemming the garment. He's also classically fixing the Achaemenid administration to make it work. So this is mainland Greece, which is maybe 100,000 square kilometers. It's like last gap, because we have Egypt, we have Libya. We're already up in Thrace, okay? We have the edges of Crimea. Let's just eat it. And then it's completely round. The whole Persian Empire is now complete. And the so-called First Persian War is not really a war. I mean, so they lose a little bit at Marathon. That was like that wasn't a major war. That was like, well,
right.
And then Athens, Sparta, they turn against and they kill Persian envoys. All right. So now we've got an army coming after them. All right. But they are very fortunate because Darius has died, and it takes 10, 15 years for the army that he was going to send to Greece is diverted to Egypt to deal with a rebellion, but also he dies. There's civil wars, and then Xerxes comes back, and this enormous army coming in. The only way you can get Mediterranean city-states to unite is to scare the hell out of them, because they are so insular that they only unite, they only create the Hellenic League when they hear, not only is he on his way, they've seen it. Hundreds of Herodotus, 1 million people, whatever it is, it's big and it's coming in their direction. So they create it, and despite the Persians losing ships to storms, they're barely held up at Thermopylae, and then they find a way. They knock out the Spartans. They're pushing against the Athenians. And had the Athenians not won a couple of battles that scared Xerxes, like, oh my God, I'm looking at this and my ships are going down. When an emperor is, whether it be like Augustus hearing about losing 3 legions in Germany, or the Han emperor being surrounded by the Xiongnu for 10 days, if you traumatize an emperor, you can change foreign policy. So when the Greeks are able to beat the Persians, at sea, and the emperor is watching, he decides to go home. They win a couple of battles, and the Spartans say, good, Persian's gone, no more alliance. And it's the Athenians who say, no, we need an alliance. They use an alliance to create an empire. Why? Because now the Greek city-states are scared, the Persians could come back, and the Athenians are the major leaders. But they do it by leagues. They do it by alliances. They don't do it by conquest. But once they've gotten that, their arche, they put it together, they force their subsidiary states to provide money, because they don't like them to actually provide ships, because if they do that, they can rebel. And they create an empire. And then when the Persian threat goes away, the empire is there. The Spartans are saying, the allies of the Spartans say, you got to take on Athens. But why does Sparta, Thucydides says that rising power, that Sparta was concerned, Athens is a rising power. But the bigger thing was it represented an entirely different way that offended the conservative Spartans, because these people they were great fighter. I mean, the Athenians did a good job on this, but their interest was money. Their interest was subversion. The interest was controlling trade. So what the Athenians were doing was taking a minimal amount of territory and allowing city-states to be ruled more or less by their own people, but they controlled the trade. They created sort of a common market. All the goods going through Athens, they were taxed. So you get an economic empire. You control the means of exchange rather than the means of production. And you deliberately avoid expanding your empire by land, which is why maritime empires usually don't even qualify as empires because it's not enough land. But if you look at their military power and their ability to control the regional economy, they're there. So
Yeah.
that's the maritime one. But
The
it's
last thing that you just mentioned is what is so striking to me about Venice, which is the case that I would mention in the history that I deal with. When you said it's
yes,
not about land, but about sort of military and power, the fact that Venice could fight wars against the Ottoman Empire, right? Like it's this tiny little republic with almost no lands taking on this massive land empire. And to be fair, it didn't win. But the fact that it could do so again and again and again, and that these wars would last for 20 years, it makes me just wonder what kind of resources Venice could muster is incredible. But the interesting thing about Venice is that if you look at its footprint in the Aegean, right, or the Mediterranean, it's these tiny little strategic nodes of control along the
yeah,
coasts and a few islands and here and there.
yeah.
And they use that to control trade routes and become very, very wealthy. So shadow empires of the steppe, what are those?
Well, shadow empires is you have steppe pastoralists whose major military advantage is horse cavalry. It's horse cavalry with compound bows, which allows them to shoot arrows very effectively over long distance, pierce armor, but is essentially its mobility. The difficulty is there's not very many steppe nomads. They're scattered across all of Mongolia. So maybe you got 1 million people, but over the course of 6, 7 million square kilometers, the population density is less. So what you do there, you have a nomad empire in which some nomad leader manages to unite the nomads because every leader, there are always leaders around that would like to do this. If you succeed, however, that's not enough because how do you hold people together that are pretty much all doing the same thing? And how do you unify them? Well, one of the ways to unify them is why don't we take this unity and raid China? Very popular. Everybody can bring some stuff home. But what the nomad empire does, its ruler deals with China and saying, we may be non-literate people, we may be, we may drink milk, which you consider like not a food at all, but we are an enemy that can cause you trouble. Let's cut a deal. And the interesting thing about the nomads is they are never looking to conquer China, they are looking to extort China. So many people think, oh, nomads, that's what they want to. They want to conquer China. They don't. They want China's stuff. So proving that you're militarily violent, what I call a predatory outer frontier strategy, you come in, you show you're violent, and then you run away. You send people in to say, this doesn't have to happen. And it's an appeasement policy, but appeasement works because our belief, you appease your enemy, he's just going to come back and take more. It works with the nomads, they want to be appeased. Okay, they don't want to rule China. You appease them enough, and finally the dynasty realizes that's a militarily important people that we are paying off. And they begin to call upon these nomads as frontier guarding barbarians to keep other nomads from attacking them. But also, and this particularly happens medieval Tang dynasty, when rebellions break out in China, the last people who come in to save the dynasty are the nomads because they have a vested relationship in maintaining that's gone on for centuries, maintaining this. If China falls apart, so does the relationship. So they will actually prop up a dynasty. Yeah. And it's secondary because when China falls into civil war, when its population begins to collapse, when its economy collapses, so does unity on the steppe. The nomads can be just as powerful, but there's nothing they can get out of China because either the economics are gone or now they're dealing with the warlords who are not keen on paying appeasement, they'll fight. And that sets up a different situation. But this ran for approximately 2,000 years. This sort of every time China united, we'd see the nomads uniting. And the Chinese have nothing good to say about the nomads, but on the other hand, you look at it and you realize you move from predatory to symbiotic. And it's really kind of an interesting pattern.
Yeah, I'd really like to see that pattern in your book because it explained a lot. I'm trying to understand Chinese history. It is not my field, but every once in a while I will read books, try to understand different periods. But you created this big pattern that helped me to understand its relationship with the nomads. And also, way back when you originally published the article, it had helped me to understand Constantinople's relationship with the Huns, like under Attila, and later the Avars, because what we know is about all of these huge payments that were going on. And I would always wonder, you read about Attila and it's like, well, he wasn't actually trying to conquer the Roman Empire. And I thought, why not? He beat them in battle every time, they caught up with him, which was not often. But he just seemed to want to extort money, lots and lots of money. And this explained why. Like, I don't think he either could have done it or could have done much with it if he had done so. And but anyway, yeah.
It's a desire, they're not interested in conquest. The interesting thing, going back to the Romans and then the Byzantines, is the nomads that they were familiar with, the Scythians and Sarmatians, never did this. They never built shadow empires.
Right.
So the entire, if you look at the Hellenistic period or whatever, nobody's worried about the Scythians raiding. It's like, or the Sarmatians. And if one goes in medieval history, the nomads that are living in Ukraine, southern Russia, they're also what we might call stateless nomads. It's the guys in the East that create this model.
Yeah, yeah.
And the argument about whether the Huns are related to the Xiongnu, hard to know, but they are definitely bringing the Xiongnu strategy with them. And that's new for Byzantium. And similarly, the Avars are also refugees. The Turks have thrown them out of Mongolia and they flee all the way to Eastern Europe. But the group of Avars that arrives is a descendant of the royal family that implemented this strategy against China. So they know exactly what they're going to do when they get there, and they do it. But from the Byzantine point of view, similar idea from what the Chinese would have. These people want to be paid off. Therefore, it's easier to buy them off and actually cheaper to buy them off than to go to war. And they're ultimately not, they don't seek to replace us. But that's hard they're such, Huns particularly, are so dangerous that our assumption would be, what else could you want to do? But if you look at the Chinese thing, you would say, no, this is a well-developed policy. Centuries before the Huns arrived, they owned this policy in China.
Yeah, in Constantinople, this creates a weird dynamic because for the emperor to be paying someone off is a kind of sign of subordination, which looks terrible. But the interesting thing is that it worked the same way on the other side. So the Khan of the Avars, because in their system, it's the leader who distributes the gifts.
Right. Yep.
So for him to be receiving gifts from Constantinople makes him look subordinate. And so they're both having to navigate this really difficult problem, this PR problem that they both had. It's kind of weird.
The Chinese deal with this by creating the tributary system, which the nomads first they said, you must come pay tribute to the emperor and you must admit that you are inferior to the emperor. They fight 40 years war saying, we're not going to do that. And then one losing side in a civil war says, got to do it. And then they discovered the Xiongnu Shanyu was ranked only below the emperor, but above all the rest of the Chinese nobility, and got huge payments. And when the nomads realized it was symbolic submission, you give 4 horses and you get thousands of bolts of silk, they just laughed at it. And a lot of Chinese say, these people are not sincere tributaries. But that solved it from the Chinese problem, because then they had a sorcerer's apprentice problems. The nomads saying, yeah, we want to print, every time we want to present tribute. No, it's too expensive. You can't, if you don't allow us to present tribute, we're going to burn your country down. So it's the same kind of thing that empires, endogenous, find ways to fix this. And the interesting thing about the nomads, since they're not part of your culture, they didn't consider themselves subordinate. So they were willing to do this because it didn't have any blowback.
Yeah. Constantinople, I think, resorted to the fiction of treating Attila as a hired general. So all the money could just be justified as a salary or something like that.
Right.
Anyway, all right. Next category is Vulture empires. Love the title.
Yeah. Empire, endogenous empires invest a lot in protecting their frontiers. Great Wall, putting, worried about the people on the frontier, protecting the center. The problem that they have is what happens when the empire weakens and then it collapses. Then it turns out that they're frontier tributaries, or sometimes frontier enemies, but in many cases they're like tributaries, move in to take power because there's no central control anymore. So you begin to grab provincial areas.
Mm.
The thing about vultures, I said, why I call them vultures, is they move in and try to keep the imperial system intact. The guys that are running it, you guys collect the taxes, you do this, we'll run it, we'll provide the military. But essentially, they're not building, they're living off a declining revenue stream of a collapsing empire. But there's a lot of revenue in a collapsing empire for centuries. So these guys come in, they're vultures, and the thing that gives them their advantage, including the people they're conquering, is they end a Hobbesian anarchy. All right? They may be foreigners, they may be barbarians, but they hire, and Chinese officials to say, this is how it's done in China. This is how you do it. This is how you provide order. And I'm sure in the Roman frontier, we see this also happening, particularly with the Franks and others. You maintain the Roman administration the best that you can. You don't destroy it. And that gives confidence to the population that the old world is continuing, not in a fashion that we would like, but these barbarians are attempting to maintain it, and in some cases, to adopt the old imperiums. It might be the religion, it might be the culture, but there's a certain amount of assimilation that's going on. But I call it a second best empire. In a land of the blind, these one-eyed kings are masters. The problem is when you restore order, then you're now a minority ruling over a majority, at which point it's the local population and its local elite going to say, thank you very much, we're taking over. We're going to take it back. And so this is extremely dangerous. The only way out of that is essentially to become an endogenous empire yourself. The Manchus start off as vultures. The Ming dynasty collapses. They move in. But when you conquer all of China, they become a Chinese empire, a vulture heritage, but an empire. In previous times, after the fall of the Han dynasty, you have dozens of these little vulture dynasties. At the end of the Han, you have, maybe 5 or 6. But it takes a couple centuries to get order restored after the Han dynasty, decades after the Tang, and almost instantaneously with the Manchus. But if you don't do that, the more sophisticated population you're going to rule over is going to oust you. So but for the time it's there. Yeah, that's, it's the belief that barbarians bring down empires, which is a common trope. It's no, collapsing empires suck in barbarians. The people that you had relationships that you either paid off or you built great walls to keep out of, as it's collapsing, those people are being sucked in. And their model of empire is yours, only they don't have the capacity to run, so it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's a mixed sort of system, and very often dual organization, a tribal military and a Chinese administration. And you see sort of a similar thing. It's a little more messy on the Roman side, but of people coming in and attempting to do that, of how much of the Roman system can we keep up? Because actually, if you're a tribal leader, what your sedentary advisors tell you is, you know what? We believe in powerful centralized rulers, and you guys believe in cooperative rule. We will help you become an autocrat.
Yeah.
And so we see actually a move more towards less egalitarian systems among these so-called barbarians that move in because they're generally egalitarian societies. And in this new situation, we see class differences emerging pretty quickly.
Yeah, as you mentioned in the Roman case, the closest I could think of to Vanquisher, Vulture Empire are the early Franks. They move into Gaul. They're not responsible for the sort of loss of Roman control over Gaul, but they move in and pick up some of the pieces.
And it looks like, I mean, unlike the Vandals or the Visigoths, the Franks seem to be very similar to the Manchus, which actually, if you look at where they're coming, it's a composite, it's an ethnic group that's invented.
Yeah.
That if you actually look at their origin,
Oh, yeah.
they come together and um, they see this as a way to organize power. And so but unlike in the Western Roman Empire, you don't have a pure shadow polity on the other side. The thing is, on China, you have, more developed polities on the other side. But yeah, it does. Medieval historians have noted that the Franks were much more open to maintaining the Roman structure. They intermarried with the Romans more than like Vandals, Visigoths, and others. So, but the thing is, they don't form. I say this is a Vulture empire. The groups like the Franks, the best they can do is sort of kingdoms, at least till you get to the Carolingians.
Right.
So
Yeah,
very long period, but they don't get quite the centralized structure that you see in China.
Right. So, Tom, you have a number of other categories in the book, but I don't think we have time to talk about them all. And I do encourage all our audience to go read the book and find out about them. And some are quite fascinating. And I intend to use some of these terms actually in future scholarship. So they include Vanquisher empires, which are pretty straightforward. Empires of nostalgia, that's a category that I really love. But also vacuum empires and jellyfish states. And I'm still thinking about the sort of East Roman example of a jellyfish state. Maybe, you know what? The crusading movement, perhaps. But anyway, yeah, it's where you.
Let's go over, the Vanquisher empire is really quick because it's essentially what happens when the periphery takes over an intact empire. It's very rare, occurred only in the Persian Empire, but we get the caliphate coming out of that. We get Alexander doing it less successfully because his generals divided up. The thing about a Vanquisher empire, unlike the Vultures who say, how much of the old system can we keep? Vanquishers say, you know what? We're going to keep the infrastructure, but we're going to totally change the culture, the organization. And they do. They're very rare. Nostalgia is just the opposite, is what happens when people would think, wouldn't it be great to have an empire? Or a ruler, okay? Like, because I could get people to cooperate. If I'm a bandit chief, it's like, you want to come raiding with me? I don't know. I got other things to do. But to be an emperor, to be, it's a suspension of belief, disbelief and we find the belief that it would be good to have an empire come back. Now, nostalgia doesn't work in China because foreigners coming in, nostalgia is their enemy. We want Chinese empires back, and they get them. But in Western Europe, where the Byzantines are unable to come back even at their heights under Justinian, if we're looking at those areas, I think, gee, wasn't it great to have an empire? And now everything's fallen apart. And they've got the Catholic Church, which is very hierarchical, and say, yeah, it would be great to have an empire, in part because we could partner with these guys, it's symbiotic. Mm-hmm. So it's the church that's pushing this. But the big thing is you get these Merovingians where you've got mayors of the palace who are replacing kings. You've got kings, but it's these mayors that are running it. And so we look at the Carolingians, the mayors take over, but they don't have the lineage. Okay, they're usurpers, and the Catholic Church says we can fix that. Yeah. God puts you in charge, and anybody that rebels, we're going to put under interdict. Okay, and so you get this symbiotic relationship. Charlemagne is made emperor, but he doesn't really take it seriously. He still sees himself more as he calls himself. He uses kingly titles, but his son, Louis the Pious, that's it's like, this is what we're going to do. And what you're able to do is Franks combine, what's today's France and Germany into a single mind. And the irony is you're creating an empire of nostalgia an empire that's largely occurring in Germanic societies. And these are the people who are responsible for keeping Rome from turning Germany into part of the empire. And we can blame them for like bringing it down too. But there's a nostalgia, but it's a particular nostalgia not for Roman emperors so much as their great empires, and particularly Christian empires.
Yeah.
So they see themselves as defending Christianity. And it's sort of the Christian version of jihad. This allows us to fight pagans. We're the empire, but now under new management that we have the defense of Catholicism. So they're going after Saxons militarily. They're moving into East Europe, trying to convert them. It's also useful. You don't want to convert them all because you can sell slaves that are pagan. So like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you look at it, people begin, it creates an idea that we are something greater. And it's really successful. I mean, the EU, like, yeah, the Carolingians, Charlemagne, that's really great. But when you look at, well, what was the administration? There's not even a capital. All right. He's moving around constantly. He doesn't have an administration. He sends edicts out. It's from an imperial point of view, particularly if you're sitting in Byzantium, I mean, in Constantinople, you're looking like, man, you guys call this an empire? And it gets worse with the Holy Roman Empire, which is the successor, because they don't even have a contiguous state. But it's a desire to make something happen. And so when the Carolingians kind of divide the place up, so it's not really an empire anymore, Holy Roman Empire comes back, and that lasts for 900 years.
Yes.
Wishful, it's like, and they have also no capital, no army, an elected emperor, but a demon court system. And it allows all of these, states in Germany, Northern Italy to solve their problems through a legal system.
Yeah.
Imprinter of the support of the popes, even though they're often in conflict with the popes. But it's a desire for an empire where none actually exists. But the desire is so strong that a good leader can say, and the Holy Roman empires do this, I am the Holy Roman Emperor of what? Well,
Yes.
I'm superior to all kings. But it falls into my shadow empires because it's true. It's the most shadowy type. Like, so where's the administration? Where's the infrastructure? It's wishful thinking, but it's very powerful wishful thinking.
Yeah, I had a medievalist colleague here in Chicago, Jonathan Lyon. Now he's moved to Vienna, and he's a specialist on the Holy Roman Empire. And we occasionally get together and to compare notes. And at one lunch, it sort of became sort of startlingly clear to us that the Roman Empire that I studied lasted for 1,000 years precisely because it had strong institutions and centralization and so forth. And his survived for almost 1,000 years for exactly the opposite reason. It was just a loose project that allowed these people to coordinate their disputes.
The Holy Roman Empire is even less centralized than the Carolingian Empire. It's the only one that goes in the opposite direction.
Yes.
But it's remarkably effective. It's remarkably effective for what it does. And it is only when its reason for existing, which is defense of religion, but also defense of inequality. It defends all of these little noble duchies. What brings about its end? The French Revolution is if you believe in equality and you're anti-religious, there's no the Holy Roman Emperor is dissolved as Napoleon appears at the gates of Vienna. It's like
there's no point to it anymore.
There's no point, and God knows what if he took it over? Let's before he can do that. But it's because the reason that it came together is gone. But speaking of religion, I would say empires have their greatest problem dealing with monotheistic religions, which is when you're dealing with Byzantium, you're saying, well, they don't have diversity, they're going after heretics and dissidents and stuff. Empires were most successful until monotheism shows up. And that's both in the Islamic world and the Christian world. Because those people believe there is a singular truth. There's a God that outranks the empire. And of course, that decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Is a famous phrase in that the common people of Rome took all religions to be equally true. The intellectuals of Rome took them all to be equally false, and the administrators of Rome found them all equally useful. The
Excellent
problem,
quote. Yes.
the problem is as soon as you get a monotheistic religion, this actually gums up the works.
Yeah.
And if you look at what's the one area of the world that doesn't have a monotheistic religion, it's China. And it maintains its imperial tradition longer and more easily than elsewhere. And so when we look at it, what we see is the Christians take over an existing state of Rome. And so the emperor is separate from the religion, but they sort of take it over and they begin to manipulate it. The Muslims are the only religion to create its own state.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them believe that they are dealing with not only absolute truth against the others, but religion and politics is so mixed that who's ever got the government is interested in using it against theological enemies. And before monotheism, it didn't, like, what do you care what other people believe? It doesn't matter. And I would say that one of the great difficulties that empires have from the medieval period on in the Muslim and Christian world is that the monotheists gum it up because monotheists do not handle diversity well. And so empires have to figure a way to work around that in a way that they did not have to do before.
Yeah, this sometimes makes me think of the moment when East Rome was verging toward empire, like in the 10th century, early 11th, when they were conquering Bulgaria and parts of northern Syria and the Caucasus and so forth. When it is apparent to me that they had the military capability of conquering more territories,
right,
but did not, and limited themselves to Christian lands, and did not push very far. Like they actually conquered Aleppo,
right,
but they deliberately left it as a sort of quasi-autonomous, self-governed Muslim state. I think because they didn't want to bring in too many, non-Orthodox, non-Christian people, because that would just make, as you said, it would gum up the works of the whole legal administrative system. It would just make it very difficult to run. But I find that that's a kind of anti-imperialist factor at work there.
It is. It's and if you look in the Muslim world, the Turkish empires that replace the caliphate, they all adopt Islam after they've created their empires. We need, the Rus adopt Eastern Orthodox, but after they've set themselves up. So when the Turks, the Ottomans, are ruling, they don't have trouble with this in part because their empires did not come out of a religious tradition. It adopted a religious tradition, it became Muslim, but they didn't have that same kind of problem. The dynasty represents multi-religious.
It's the dynasty. You're right. It's the dynasty, not so much the religion. Yeah.
But in the caliphate and later, with the Byzantines, these two get so pushed together that, certainly the Islamic conquest is aided by the fact that, the Chalcedonians are oppressing other people. And the thing with the Muslims is, at least in the Umayyad dynasty at the beginning, they're not interested in converting them. They say, because you got to pay your infidel tax.
Right. Yeah.
But from the point of view of a Christian, well, at least we're not being persecuted because you guys are Muslims. You don't care what the Christians believe. It's like, just don't cause trouble.
So in your book, you also talk about the factors that led to the extinction of the exogenous empires. We don't have time to talk about them now, but I refer our audience to the book itself. It's all very well laid out, and you present all of these cases very clearly. Tom, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and also for writing the book. It was a great joy to read, and I love this kind of comparative studies of empires that range across time and space. And thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.